I'm going to talk a little bit about the 001 1953 Corvette and some of the questions surrounding it. I just want to summarize a few things about this story and maybe put some minds at ease for the few disbelievers still out there. I've heard people say there's just too much controversy surrounding this car, or there's too many unanswered questions. After studying the car and supporting documents, I don't see any controversy at all, and there are very few unanswered questions. I spent quite a bit of time on the internet observing reactions to this car when it first came to light, and there was considerable doubt about its authenticity, as well there should have been. So for those of you who still doubt the legitimacy of this car, let's take a moment to review the facts here. It is a fact that the first 12 cars were of the one-piece floor construction. There's no debate there. This is a one-piece floor car, inspected and verified by several 53 experts. Okay, so now it has to be one of the first 12 cars. The next logical question is, how many of those first 12 cars are accounted for? The answer is 9. No debate there. The cars are well documented and the owners are known. What does that leave us with? 1, 7, or 10. No other options. Every other car is accounted for. Okay, why can't it be 7 or 10? Simple. Only number 1 and number 2 had the modifications done to them that are outlined in the engineering work orders issued for those first 2 cars. Now I can guess what you're thinking. Number 2 had the same modifications? Why can't it be number 2? That would be special in its own right. A close examination of photos that the engineering department took of the engine compartment of number 2 when it got the first V8 transplanted into it in early '54 show there are additional holes drilled in the firewall to accept the V8 swap. Those holes are not present on Corey's car. You cannot undrill a hole. The firewall on Corey's car is virgin bare fiberglass. Because of the fiberglass construction of 53s, where they use cloth instead of matting, it has a definite grid or crosshatch pattern to it, sort of like burlap. Basically speaking, it would be impossible to patch it and make it undetectable. There is no evidence of any repair work ever being done on the firewall. Therefore, if it doesn't match the firewall of number 2, it can only be number 1. There are no other options. 7 and 10 did not have the modifications done to them that 1 and 2 did. Of course, indisputable evidence will not convince the hardcore disbelievers. Some have even suggested that Corey modified the car to match the work orders. Besides the difficulty of finding one of the 3 unaccounted for early 53s to begin alterations on, the problem with this theory is this car was known about back in the 1980s with the modifications present back then, approximately 40 years before Corey bought the car, and an easy decade before the work orders and documents were discovered at Chevrolet that describe the changes to be made. He would need a time machine to pull off these changes. And if Corey has access to a time machine, I think his efforts could be better spent elsewhere. Then there are those that try to discredit Corey by saying, how come a nobody from Utah discovers this iconic car and no one else recognized it as number 1? And it was looked at by several experts, and they didn't think it was anything. What makes him so special? Well, as I see it, there are all levels of experts out there. There are C1 experts, 53 to 55 experts, 53 only experts, and even a few early 53 experts, but not very many. And these guys are experts in restoration, body, paint, mechanical, interiors, judging, etc. but they are not historians. Why would anyone dedicate literally thousands of hours going through old work orders and documents? Well, Corey was doing research for a book, and while doing so, connected the dots, so to speak. To put it simply, the experts that looked at the car 20, 30, 40 years ago did not have the information available to them to properly identify it at that time. And when the information did become available, it wasn't easily accessible to the average Joe. You basically needed to know someone on the inside, and by then interested in the car had cooled off to the point it was just another forgotten curiosity. Another question that comes up is just look at the serial number or the frame stamping. The car was completely disassembled and the VIN number was not attached to the car at that time. Just look at the frame stamping. Well, that'd be nice, but the frame is not a 53 frame. Red flag alert. Why would the frame be changed? Well, if you take time to read all the work orders on early 53s, it's clearly outlined that several cars had frame swaps for various reasons while still in the engineering department. So there's no reason to believe that this one should have escaped a similar fate. Engineering documents show that 2, 3, 7, and 9 had frame swaps. So it's really kind of par for the course. Aha, you say it's just the body of number 1, not the whole car. Yes, it is just the body. This thing was no virgin. It definitely had a hard life. It would have been nice if it was found intact and unmolested with all the original equipment still in place, but it just wasn't. However, another way to look at it is, it's the body of the first Corvette off the assembly line. Final question I'd like to address is the old, well, everybody knows that the first 2 Corvettes were destroyed. I did some research into that claim and its probable origin. I found no mention of that statement in my search about early 53s before Corvette News magazine did the 1953 Corvette owner survey back in the summer of 1969. After the results came in, they were pleased to see that 003 had survived. And at that time, they only described it as the oldest Corvette to respond to the survey. No mention that the first 2 cars were destroyed. And this was a Chevrolet published magazine, only 16 years after the 53s left the factory. I think they would have said something if it had been common knowledge the first 2 were destroyed. But I can see how that would possibly plant the seed that eventually grew to thinking the first 2 didn't exist. Then, to compound the myth, is John Amgort's article in the summer of 1993 in CRS Driveline magazine that details the first cars. And if your comprehension is poor, after reading the article, you could think he, an expert, said the first 2 Corvettes were destroyed. Number 1, with 111 miles on it, was burned in a test, and number 2 was scrapped. Well, that's almost what he said, but not really. What he actually said was that the first Motorama car, EX52, was burned, and EX53, the second Motorama car, underwent a body swap and was later destroyed. So, to be fair, the first 2 Corvettes were destroyed, but they were not 001 and 002. They were the Motorama show cars, both pre-production Corvettes. I have found no mention of this myth before John's article was published in 1993. But that was 30 years ago. Plenty of time has passed for the misinformation to get spread around to become the everybody knows story. There was one other not too well-known theory that claims the 2 Motorama cars were essentially used as stand-ins for the first 2 production cars on the assembly line. This story is that the production of bodies was lagging behind, and to meet the press deadline on June 30th, 1953, The Motorama cars were dressed to look like production cars and posed on the line, and then they were later destroyed, aligning with the first 2 Corvettes were destroyed story. To the casual observer, Motorama cars do appear almost identical to production cars, but on closer examination, they are vastly different. If you are interested in seeing the differences and the reasons that it's impossible they are the same cars, just go to the internet and look up, could the Motorama cars really be the first 2 production cars? Google that. I have comparison photos there and explanations why it's simply not possible. Are there still going to be doubters? Of course, there's some that will never give in, and that's fine. But I believe that any rational person can see the car is the real deal. It's been suggested that a group of experts get together and examine the car as a collective and come down with a final decision. While that hasn't happened as such, most of the folks that would be at such a gathering have indeed looked the car over, and they have all confirmed Corey's claims. No one has provided any evidence to the contrary. That alone speaks volumes to me. So is it still controversial? I think it's cut and dried. Are there still questions? Some history is missing between 1954 and the early 70s, but that's pretty good for a 70-year-old mystery. And if you're interested in looking at John Amgwert's article, it's on the internet. If you look at Corvette Restorer, Summer 2018, the earliest Corvettes. Look that up and you can see his article in full. I think that's the last thing I wanted to address. Thank you and good night.